Hello, it's Tom here. Before we kick off this week's episode, I just wanted to let you all know about a couple of brilliant shows at this year's Edinburgh Fringe. Simon Evans, stand-up comedian, Radio 4 regular and Spiked columnist, is doing 2 daily shows at the Fringe this year. They're called Alas, Smith and Hume and Footnotes to Smith. If you're in Edinburgh and a fan of Simon's witty, learned Spiked columns, you really won't want to miss these shows. They are both comedic lectures in which Simon brings to life the big ideas and debates that animated the Scottish Enlightenment. The values of this extraordinary era of progress, Simon says, could offer the way out from today's tit-for-tat culture warring and stifling political correctness. Both shows are being held at Panmure House, where Adam Smith spent the last 10 years of his life. They're going on every day, apart from Mondays, until the 25th of August. You can find links for tickets to Alas, Smith and Hume and Footnotes to Smith in the description for this episode. Now, without further ado, let's get on with Last Orders. Hello, and welcome back to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined by my co-host, Dr. Chris Snowdon. How are you doing, Chris?
Hello, Mr. Slater. How are you doing? And hello, Mr. and Mrs. Listener.
All 2 of them. And we're also delighted to be joined on the show today by Mark Johnson, who's the advocacy manager at Big Brother Watch. How are you doing, Mark?
Very well, thanks for having me.
So, Mark, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on is to talk about the after the riots period and how it's really been defined by government pushing for censorship, effectively. We've got Keir openly calling, or at least mulling over, toughening up online safety, quote-unquote, legislation. There's also been a string of arrests ranging from incitement to violence through incitement to hatred through to just offensive online posts. I know Big Brother Watch, freedom of speech is a core issue of yours. What have you made of the crackdown, I guess, that's happened after the horrible scenes that we saw a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's another kind of crisis in British public life, but as is so often the case, knee-jerk reactions and a kind of reach for the authoritarian lever, if you like. I mean, I thought some of the interventions, not necessarily from the government, but from other Labour politicians were quite, extraordinary, talking about reviewing or even like beefing up online safety legislation that actually hasn't been implemented yet. It was only passed last year, and given that it is extremely, complicated legislation with a myriad of like existing free speech problems, the idea that they should then review it before it's been brought in, make it, harsher, if you like. And, quite frankly, we're talking about people like, with all due respect to Sadiq Khan, who is the mayor of London. He doesn't do kind of tech policy. He doesn't think about these things in great detail. It's just an authoritarian lever that's been pulled, it's been yanked. And yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of irresponsible. A lot of people have looked at this stuff in a lot of detail. We worked on the legislation when it was going through. There was obviously the terrible concept of legal but harmful speech, which we managed to, scrap, which was brilliant. But that would be the kind of the thing that they would probably try and bring back.
They're saying that quite explicitly.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously looking at things like disinformation, trying to crack down disinformation. I mean, how you could do that without censoring is just, it's impossible. Who creates the definitions of what is and isn't disinformation? It's pretty absurd. It's a pretty bleak picture. The only kind of small source of solace is that the government have said that they don't actually intend to like review or to beef up the legislation at this time. So for the time being, it's the small things, grateful for that. But I mean, it's in the broader picture of quite a kind of authoritarian crackdown.
I mean, there's also the new things which have happened. So we've already seen one arrest under a certain provision of the Online Safety Act against false communications. Someone was arrested on the basis of that because they were perceived to be the source of the misinformation about the Southport killer. That case is still kind of rumbling on. But it does feel like, Chris, that we're sort of opening Pandora's box where censorship is concerned. We've had a lot of hate speech laws in this country, a lot of malicious communications laws and so on for a very long time. And while there have been kind of false communication things on the books, it feels like we're getting to a point now where the government is becoming more and more interested in just policing what's true and false. What did you make of all of that?
Well, that could be the way it goes. I mean, I think once the fog of war is lifted, perhaps it won't be quite as bad. People have been pretty hysterical about this, particularly on Twitter, and calling for Twitter itself to be closed down. I haven't seen any convictions and sentences which seemed ridiculously over the top. I mean, there haven't been many at all from like just people saying things, right? The one I have seen, which was, I think Wednesday, was some old woman who had said, burn the...
I think it was the mosque with all the adults.
Burn the mosque with all the adults in. Well, that is just incitement, right? I think most people who consider themselves to be free speech absolutists are still against incitement.
Yeah.
So that was a specific case. There was another one actually the week before, which was obviously just incitement. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's just like, well, let's get down that hotel, burn it to the ground. Again, that's incitement. Whether 2 years is an appropriate sentence, possibly not. But I'm kind of on side with giving people quite heavy sentences for this because, well, firstly, I'm in favour of just up oil people going to prison for a long time. So I'm going to be consistent about this, right? And of course, they've got their defenders, people saying peaceful protest, blah, 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 blah. No, part of sentencing, part of the criminal judicial service is deterrence. And if you send a few people to prison for quite a long stretch for doing something that might not be the worst thing in the world, but is still illegal, and you're trying to deter other people from doing it, I think that's fair enough. Did you see the two lads in Hartlepool? There's these two gay lads in Hartlepool. They were playing bingo.
Oh, yes.
Right? And they were a bit drunk by their own admission. Now, by their account, they came out of the bingo hall, not even knowing there was a protest going on, ended up being at the very front of it, just jeering and gesticulating, really. One of them got bitten on the arse by a police dog. And that was about it. I don't think they threw anything. They were just obnoxious, And they got more than 2 years each. And you can say, well, that wouldn't happen in a normal course of events. And of course it wouldn't do. And of course it wouldn't have happened with the Black Lives Matter protests and various other things. We know this. But what they did was still illegal. And it's just their bad luck, really. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. No one forced them to get involved in this protest. And the fact of the matter is, I'm sure that will deter people from getting involved in riots in the future. I think it might have actually quite a big effect across the board for even things like football hooliganism and so on. With the very high profile sentences handed out very quickly. I mean, really, it's how you would expect a proper Tory government to react to a riot. When you look at it, that's how you would expect a fairly right-wing Tory government to react. And I wouldn't be against it, and I'm not particularly against it. I haven't seen any sentences so far that strike me as being completely out of order. I think you might be referring to the Bernie's tweets before. I don't think what she said was in any way illegal, and I don't think it will go to court. They haven't charged it yet. They haven't. I don't think they can, because she starts the tweet off by saying, if this is true, and then says, I heard it from such and such a person. And it's not incitement, because the person that she said was the perpetrator was a completely made up individual. Yeah. If it had been a real person, then, okay, that would have been a different kettle of fish. But it was complete fake news. And yeah, obviously it would be concerning if fake news starts to become a criminal offence. Yeah. But I haven't seen any evidence of that.
I think we do have to be careful even with categories like incitement, of course, insofar as incitement to violence, no civilised society allows for that, even America, bound by the First Amendment and so on. Yeah. In America, it's worth saying it's very tightly defined. Like, it has to be speech which is intended and likely to cause imminent lawless action, which someone sounding off on their Facebook page, which is followed by 12 of their relatives, you can have an argument as to whether that should be criminal, or indeed whether, if there is a penalty, how severe it should be. Yeah. But then there's also loads of other things. There's incitement to hatred, which I think is any genuine free speech sport should have concerns about. Yeah. We're also edging into this new territory. But I think, as you say, there are shades of grey which are worth dwelling on. But it does feel, Mark, doesn't it, that at the very least, it has been a period in which the view that censorship is the answer to society's problems has sort of been bolstered.
I would say so. And when you're hearing kind of, legitimate proposals by supposedly credible politicians to actually ban entire social media sites or kind of, I don't know, like geo-block them, these are the sorts of tactics that you would expect to see in pretty brutal kind of authoritarian regimes, talking about banning Twitter. It has been proposed as a serious measure. I don't think Elon Musk has helped immensely with some of the things that he said at points, but I mean, that's by the by. It doesn't matter. The idea that we should just outright, ban an entire communications network, because that is what it is at the end of the day, is pretty absurd. So it feels like the Overton window is shifting, in a bad way, and that people are more kind of au fait with the idea that censorship is, a good thing and is a legitimate response to crises in public life, basically.
Speaking of fake news on Twitter, can we discuss some of the various theories that were going around from the sensibles about this particular issue? So there are various theories put forward. One of them was by a friend of the show, Peter Jukes, of the Byline Times.
Good friend of yours.
I was in W Smith the other day. I actually saw a physical copy of Byline Times.
I didn't realise it was actually
a real
print
thing.
Publication.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
The Mosley Times, as we used to call it.
Somebody said, I can't help but wonder whether these vile race riots were coordinated by far-right provocateurs to coincide with the election of a Labour government. That's fairly mental, because it would require them to get somebody to kill some children.
That's a logistical nightmare, really, when you think about it.
So Jukes tries to trump that, I think succeeds, by saying, I'd question even further. Was it information from the security services that there was a far-right plan in concert with US dark money and big tech broligarchs to cause mayhem this summer, which led Sunak to call a snap election in July.
And also, like bro and oligarch.
Oligarchs. Yeah.
Sounds like some sort of infection.
Maybe we do need to bring in disinformation laws after all.
And then there's a guy called Charles Tallock, Director of Data Analytics at the Health Foundation, former Whitehall civil servant, used to work at the NHS, so classic sensible, right? And he put a long Twitter thread together blaming the riots on Elon Musk making likes private.
Yes, I saw this. This is great.
So his theory is, because you can no longer see who's liking what, that this gives a boost to racist tweets, which you can see it's possible, right? That people
so you're more likely to like it because people won't see that you've liked it, hence it pushes it up the algorithm.
Well, that's what he's saying, yeah, it gives it a bump. And he says, this subtle change made by Musk seems likely to have fueled the race riots which erupted across England. I think it's also likely that Musk foresaw what the effect of his change could be. Getting likes, I guess, does bump it up a little bit, but only if you're using For You. I think a lot of the problem people have with Twitter is they can't use Twitter properly. Don't ever use For You. It's a complete sewer. It's poison for you. It's there to wind you up. If you go on following, you see the people you follow.
You've chosen who you follow, yeah.
You've chosen who you follow. If one of your followers retweets something you don't like, then unfollow them. This liking stuff and all this algorithms, it makes no difference. You literally just see who you follow. And people keep saying, oh, Twitter's gone to hell in a handcart since Elon Musk took over. I just haven't seen any evidence of it. I don't see any of this stuff, really.
I think so many of these problems, as we've said many times, would be sorted out if politicians were taught how to use social media properly. Because so many of these panics is people are calling me names. Yeah. So if they learn how to filter out their responses, or they learn how to just not go on it, so
or block people,
or block people. That's it.
Maybe I blocked 8,000 people. Maybe that's why I don't see.
It would be so much. We just need some like tech support. But
so then we hang on before we finish this. We also got on Twitter people threatening to leave Twitter but not actually doing so. How
could we forget?
As happens every year or two. Richard Murphy, the sage of Ely. No Pazaran is my cry. I will stay and say what I think is right.
I love that.
Thank God.
That's my favourite response, when they think they're the French resistance.
Yeah. It's amazing how many people think they are literally living in 1930s Germany. Alistair Campbell. A lot of people have been asking me if I'm leaving Twitter. Staying for now on the grounds that you should fight the far right wherever they are. So brave.
And Mark, just to, before we move on, talk about some of the other civil liberties issues, because one of the first things Keir Starmer did was talk about rolling out facial recognition technology, which has gone under the radar a little bit now because of the fact the focus has been on the censorship. But I know this is something that Big Brother Watch have done a lot of work on. So do you want to tell us a little bit about this technology and why it's such a problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we often talk about when civil liberties. We often think about like ID cards, but we've moved on such a long way from that. And the reality is, we no longer need the state no longer needs a kind of card to identify you. You could actually just physically track you by scanning your face and taking a print of your biometric data, essentially. And that's what facial recognition does, basically. Unlike a conventional CCTV camera, it takes a picture of everybody's face that's in the shot. And the form of facial recognition that we're most concerned about is called live facial recognition. So that could be used on a mass crowd of people. It could be, at a football match, in a town square, in a busy place, shopping centre, something like that. And essentially what it does is takes a scan of every single person's face and comparing it to a watch list. Obviously, from a privacy perspective, it's pretty concerning because you don't necessarily consent to having your data collected in this way. And you're talking about the identification of scores and scores of innocent people, not just people that might be wanted for offences. Keir Starmer came out after the riots and said that he was going to look at the expansion of this technology. Unfortunately, as we were talking about before, when it comes to crises, there will be actors in society who are looking to push their agenda or their technology or whatever it is. And when a moment of crisis comes along, it seems like a good moment. And there are people, in the UK, particularly the police, a lot of police forces, absolutely desperate to use this technology. And so that's something that they're now looking at. Just from a kind of practical perspective, I can't understand how it would necessarily be beneficial in a riot type situation, because if the police are at a riot, they're going to probably want to arrest the people that are immediately rioting. They're not going to say, oh, that person's not on the watch list, so we'll just let them go. So this
guy's got a clean record. Throwing Molotov cocktails.
He's not on the list, so he's fine. Yeah. I don't really actually fully understand how it would be useful in that situation. But, at the same time, we're also, there's a report out on the Met today. It kind of ranks all the different competencies and, how well they're doing at each different kind of function of, policing. And one of the core kind of inadequacies was that they're not good at investigating crime. which you would think is probably one of the core functions.
It's like the NHS.
It really should work on
weak link and keeping people alive.
So you would think that at this time, when the Met is not really doing particularly well, and they're one of the largest police forces pushing for the use of facial recognition, you would think that they should really kind of think about the nuts and bolts of policing, rather than essentially what they're doing is looking for a needle in a haystack. So they're dropping a camera in a busy place, and normally it's not at a riot. It will be in a town square, by a railway station, at a football match, and they're hoping that someone comes by, and it could be 15 officers that it takes, and they might make one arrest. I mean, we track like the arrests and the activity at these deployments. They might make one arrest. Sometimes they make no arrests. Sometimes they also get the wrong person because the tech fails and that person is misidentified. So, given all these combinations, it's not really, to my mind, a great use of police time. Taking into account the report on the Met that's come out today, I really don't think it's the way forward. But it's, again, slightly cynical of Keir just to pull the lever and say, we're going to look at this. This could be a great response.
And the police's willingness to sort of waste their time or resources on things which make them look bad and also aren't necessarily effective is seemingly boundless. I mean, like the censorship we've seen in recent years has been sort of prosecuted by the police, by which I mean arresting people. The number of times where they kind of arrested a gender-critical feminist for misgendering someone on the internet, and then eventually either a prosecution doesn't take place or it eventually gets overturned because they've been overzealous in how they've pursued it and the CPS pursued it. So many cases of that.
As well. Non-crime hate incidents, another example of, police...
Invented by the College of Policing. Like, there was no law that was passed to start that.
Using resources essentially to, put, innocent people on lists. Again, all the while to the backdrop of... basically failing at the nuts and bolts and the fundamentals, really. So.
And that's one thing that sort of reminds me, there's been a lot of interest, obviously, particularly in America as well, because of Elon Musk's intervention in when did Britain suddenly become so censorious. And I'm less relaxed than you are, Chris, about where some of these arrests are going and what precedent it might set. But even so much of this was going on at such an alarming scale beforehand. I mean, that figure from a few years ago that more than 9 people a day were being arrested under the Communications Act for saying offensive things online. Someone worked out that means that Britain is comfortably, just on that piece of legislation, in one partial survey that didn't even look at all police districts because they didn't all respond to the FOI. Even on that one survey, we were comfortably locking up more people than America did during the first Red Scare. So it's the scale of this has been terrible for some time, even if people are only now taking interest.
But they're not resulting in prosecutions, is that what you're saying?
In those cases, those were arrests. I'm not sure if there was a follow-up about prosecutions. I'm just saying that even with kind of existing legislation, there's plenty of people who are being prosecuted under the willingness of police to arrest people who shouldn't have been arrested, even under the legislation we've got.
Speaking of which, if you go back, listeners, a few episodes ago, just to the one just before the election, you will remember me saying or predicting that none of these political betting arrests and prosecutions will ever come to anything, and we'll never hear anything about this scandal ever again. Now, was I right or was I right? Completely disappeared.
That's true. But on the court's busy, the...
They were just up oil in the far right. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, nothing.
Is it too early to declare that prediction correct, I suppose? What was that?
Well, okay, I'm just reminding listeners.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to it next month, shall we?
We will keep an eye on that. But, Chris, shall we turn to the junk science section of this podcast? Will you pick out...
Thriving section these days.
Exactly. People are loving it. It's the talk of every pub I go into. So let's talk about a couple of things that you've picked out this week. Shall we start with claims that are being made about minimum pricing? This is obviously a policy that you've railed against for many years. And from what I understand from a piece that you've written about this, researchers are now trying to claim that even just announcing this policy stopped people from drinking.
Yeah, it had more effect than the policy actually coming into effect, which is not very hard, seeing it didn't have any effect at all. This is, it sounds like I'm lying when I talk about some of these studies. I promise you, listeners, I'm not exaggerating or making this up. So, as long-term loyal listeners will know, minimum pricing in Scotland didn't work, or indeed in Wales, or anywhere else. But there's a lot of effort being made to pretend it did work. Various academics are desperately publishing anything that might support the case, because minimum pricing is now, or very soon, will be going up to 65p from 50p. So this particular piece of research, which didn't get any media attention, but I came across it, they looked at overall alcohol consumption and what they call heavy drinking. Heavy drinking, believe it or not, is more than 14 units for a woman and 21 units for a man.
What's that in drinks? How does that work out?
It's about 7 drinks for a woman and about 10 for a man in a week, not a day. So that's heavy drinking, and apparently it has been in decline for 20-odd years in Scotland. Overall alcohol consumption has, broadly speaking, been in decline for the last 20 years. So they looked at the period, for some reason, between 2012 and 2017, and then looked at the period from 2018 to 2021. Minimum pricing came in 2018, so that you would think the latter of those is a relevant time period. But of course, that also included the pandemic, when things went crazy. Heavy drinkers drank a lot more, moderate drinkers drank a lot less. Overall, people drank less. But that had nothing to do with minimum pricing, really. That was to do with the pandemic. And alcohol-related deaths went through the roof. So they said, yeah, alcohol consumption went down between 2012 and 2017, and it went down to a lesser extent after minimum pricing came in 2018. And the best explanation for this is that the Scottish government announced minimum pricing in 2012 and also banned sort of buy one, get one free deals or volume price discounts on bottles of wine, things like that. Well, it's been shown in 2 studies, including the NHS evaluation, that multi-buy discount ban had 0 effect on alcohol consumption. So it couldn't have been that. And really, do we think it was actually the announcement? You think it was Nicola Sturgeon standing up saying, this is a good policy, we're going to do it? And the Scots went, well, might as well stop drinking now then. Because I
want to get ahead of this.
It then got held up in the courts for years and years and years.
Yeah.
Thanks to our good friend of the show, David Frost, at the Scotch Whisky Association. And they genuinely make this claim. It's unbelievable that they think people are going to fall for it. But there is a precedent for this, because with the sugar tax, which we discussed sugar tax stuff before, there are studies on tooth decay and sugar consumption and obesity, all of which say there was an effect in 2016 when the sugar tax was announced, but not in 2018 when the thing actually came in. In actual fact, there wasn't an effect really in either of those dates. There was, round about 2016, there was a bit of a drop in sugar consumption. But I think that was more to do with the general hysteria around it. It certainly wasn't really due to George Osborne, and his powerful oratory during the budget saying we're going to introduce a sugar tax. But they kind of have to do that because there's so obviously no impact in 2018. And similarly with plain packaging, which everyone's forgotten about now, plain packaging for tobacco, they did a post-implementation review, legal requirement, I think, and there was obviously no effect on cigarette consumption or smoking rates in 2017 when plain pack started going on the shelves. So they said, there was a bit of an unusual drop in the smoking rate in 2016. Well, there was an unusually large rise in the number of vapors in 2016, which is a way more plausible explanation, but they never mentioned that. And so they say, well, we think that just the knowledge that plain packaging was going to come in had more effect than the actual. I think
it's sweet that they think people are so tuned in to the state policy discussion.
Really paying a lot of attention.
Away that implementation.
It's pathetic, isn't it? But yeah, incredible.
Despite my plumby sounding English accent, I actually grew up in the Scottish borders, and I can tell you anecdotally that road to Berwick has gotten a lot busier over the years.
Yes.
I won't dog my parents in, but yeah.
Apparently 20% of the people who live sort of within an hour of the border in Scotland have gone to England just to buy alcohol. That's quite a lot of people.
I can imagine that, yeah.
Because it's not it's much easier from in Wales. You just go over the Severn Bridge. There's literally an Asda on the other side of the border, But Scotland, it takes quite a bit of effort, but people still do it.
Yeah. And what, in your experience, do people feel about these kinds of policies? Because it's certainly something that the SNP has looked to pioneer.
I mean, just speaking offhand, I think the fact that it probably hits the poorest the hardest is noted, in as much as it's the cheap alcohol that will be affected. But you would often hear people say, like, and it was the Scottish borders that I grew up in, so it's very, very south of Scotland, but people would actually genuinely. I had a friend who had a wedding recently, and his family went down to Berwick for a huge haul of booze. I mean, I'm not joking, like genuinely. So it has, people do try and dodge it and think of smart ways around it.
What kind of booze are they buying, I'm interested? Because it tends to be the cider that tends to be most worth buying.
I honestly, I can't remember now off the top of my head, but it would,
Is that badly hit, the cider?
Massively, yeah. Okay. Strong cider.
Oh, of course, yeah. The park bench stuff.
Unit, pound for pound, like strong, Frosty Jack and so on, was ridiculously cheap. And now that's kind of been wiped out in Scotland. And people just drink vodka instead. So that's a big improvement. And
exactly.
alcohol-related deaths are at a 14-year high. So it's obviously worked, this policy.
It's all going brilliant.
We just need to put it up to 65p.
So before we close out of here, Chris, do you want to tell us also about the other study that you picked out, which I believe is about dementia? Correct. And the question of, does alcohol make you more likely to get it? Because obviously every discussion in public health is seemingly wanting us to live a life as sober as a priest, not smoking, not drinking, and so on. So is dementia another potential impact of having the occasional drink?
So they're saying, yeah. So this is a study in The Lancet, which is an update on a study from 4 years ago in which they found 12 risk factors, modifiable risk factors for dementia. And this time they found 14. I can't remember what the new two are. One of them is hearing loss. And bad eyesight and hearing loss are both considered risk factors for dementia, which you might think, well, they're just symptoms of being old, and old people are wanting to,
and surely being old is the biggest risk factor
by far, and really the massive rise in dementia, which will continue to genuinely cripple the health and social care system as the years go on, is a result of people living healthier lives. I mean, if more people smoked, there would be fewer people with dementia. As simple as that. There'd be fewer people. Let's face it. They, not unpredictably, Tom, they say that, the problem here actually is smoking again, and alcohol and obesity. It's like just every time, same scapegoats every single time. Realistically, like I say, it's because people are living healthier lives and they're living longer, and medical science has improved. But you have an aging society, you can have a lot of people with dementia, which is a horrible disease, really painful for everybody involved, can kill you, more likely to die with it. But either way, it's no picnic. And rather than just accept that as being the kind of the price you pay for getting rid of the diseases of middle age, they say, no, we're going to double down on the smokers and the drinkers and the obese, which even, according to this study, those three categories, excessive alcohol consumption, smoking and obesity, it only makes up 4% of all the cases of dementia worldwide. Is it really worth going after these things? But what interested me was the discussion of alcohol in this. So this is all based on observational epidemiology, which you can take with as much salt as you like. But let's assume that correlation does equal causation, which effectively is what these people do assume. However much they might caution in the limitations part of the study, of course, this doesn't prove causation. Everything else they say pretty much shows you that they think this is causal effects. So they've got excessive alcohol consumption. They say that excessive alcohol consumption, which is 21 plus units, heavy drinking again. They say this is linked to dementia, which it might be, but the study that they cite as proof for this was a study of people who drink until they pass out. Genuinely heavy drinking, basically, but not 21 units a week. But then, as they have to acknowledge, there is masses of evidence that people who drink moderately have a significantly lower risk of dementia, as with heart disease, right? And as with heart disease, they just point blank refuse to admit that this is true. So it's kind of funny in the study in a nerdy way, because they go through all these risk factors and go, well, we've got epidemiology saying this, there's an association of 13% more likely to get this and that, what have you. And then they get to alcohol, it's like excessive alcohol. Yes, a study shows that you're 30% more likely to get dementia if you drink until you pass out. And there's all these other studies say you're 30% less likely to get dementia if you drink moderately, but you have to remember that correlation doesn't mean causation. There could be all sorts of confounding factors, and maybe the people who give up drinking are just more likely to get dementia for some reason. And it's just this sort of pathetic kind of coping and refusal to look the facts in the face. And nicotine doesn't get mentioned at all. Now, nicotine is actually a very promising drug for dementia. In the old days, it used to be widely believed that smoking prevented Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. That has since apparently been debunked.
And if it was, but even if it was, presumably it'd be the nicotine, not the tar.
Indeed, it would be the nicotine. Well, nicotine is the research is going on amongst academics and the pharmaceutical industry, looking at the potential of nicotine for Alzheimer's and dementia in general. So it's not totally implausible that if this is right, if the nicotine actually does prevent it, obviously smoking could well have prevented it. But
cigarettes on the NHS.
Be that as it may, there are loads of proven benefits to your brain, basically, cognitive benefits from nicotine. There isn't a lot of haste being shown by academics to investigate these further, but it seems perfectly plausible that a bit of moderate drinking and a few nicotine pouches may well be, the answer to dementia. May very well protect it for it. Certainly the moderate drinking looks pretty strong. But they can never admit this, of course, because this would encourage people to vape and to drink, and you can't do that. And so you just have this same old conflict, don't you, between the truth and the noble lie that they want you to believe. And it's just so hard to take these people seriously when they're pretty obviously lying to you.
Mark, I don't know if you've got anything to add on the whole dementia nicotine purchase thing.
Not exactly my area of expertise, but interesting what you say about also some of these studies that make enormous leaps of faith with the kind of causation correlation point. Just to go completely full circle, we often see it when we're talking about, the impact of, and it's such a nebulous concept, but harm of, things like social media, and then it goes right back round to then the sensorial solutions and things like online safety legislation. So I battle through some studies that are similar, of a similar nature to Chris, and as much as some interesting claims being made and not necessarily good outcomes as a result.
You start with a policy and then you work backwards.
Yeah, work out how you're going to get there. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And so, Mark, before we let you go to enjoy your moderate drinking and nicotine patches, we always ask our guests on this podcast one final question, because we're a very libertarian, anti-ban podcast. We ask people to say if they had to have one ban, what would it be? And the only rules is that it can't be worthy, really. It can't be something, you can't ban censorship.
Yeah.
Something that annoys you. Chris is famously his wheelie suitcases.
Do you know, recently I've seen this kind of like rise in the use of mini personal fans, and I don't know why, but it really kind of irritates me. It seems slightly pathetic. I don't know, grown adults with these mini fans.
On the tube,
on the tube mostly, yeah. I mean, it has been pretty warm, down here in London recently, but there's something about it, grown adults, and they're so small. I don't know what
they look like a child's fan.
They do, like you can imagine the kids with the little helicopter hats. Maybe that's next. It's the slippery slope. But yeah, the mini fans, I reckon. Let's just get rid of them. We can start on the tube. Sadiq Khan can come in and ban them, and then that can be the test pilot, and we'll see. Nationwide after that, maybe.
Absolutely. If you want people on a cool down, they should be allowed to drink on the tube again.
Yeah,
that can be the trade-off.
Yeah, Boris Johnson, wasn't it?
It was great libertarian.
Now, quickly, Tom, before we finish, we have got some monkeypox news.
Oh, of course, yeah. Sorry,
Mpox now, of course, as it's called, because the word monkeypox is somehow racist. This is a public health podcast. We want everyone to be safe out there. So if you are going to a fetish party this weekend, I think you are, Tom.
Yep.
Just try and cover any open sores.
I'll try my best. But sometimes the moment
we're not going to tell you how to live, but do try and cover the open sores.
Well, I appreciate your concern, and if I'm back in 2 weeks' time, people know that I made it out okay. Chris and Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.